This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Support for this program comes from the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation, committed to funding educational causes.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, for years, scientists had been warning about what they called the big one. 20 years ago, the big one came along with the predicted winds and water and sudden changes in people's lives. We'll be looking at Hurricane Katrina, both the damage and the recovery. We begin with the examining of the evolution of the storm, plus the legacy of broken levees and their aftermath. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Bruce Katz, chief meteorologist for WVUE-TV, Fox 8, LeBron Joseph, news anchor and reporter, WGNO-TV, Channel 26, and Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio. Going over to Bruce first, because Katrina, that was definitely the big one. So how did Katrina get her start, and give us her path?
Well, it was actually a very short-lived storm. It was only 6 days from the beginning to the hit on Plaquemines Parish. So on the 23rd, it developed from a wave that was off of the, basically, Bahamas. It moved westward, and a lot of the models were indicating that there was a weakness in the steering. High pressure was over the system. It was getting stronger. And the big question was, is it going to cross over the peninsula and move in the Gulf? Will it stay on the eastern side? Indications were more likely it was going to head toward the Gulf. So as it moved into Florida, it intensified. Naturally, it weakened as it moved overland and then exploded within 2 to 3 days into what it was, the storm that we all remember. So on Wednesday, prior to the Monday it hit, basically it started just as a wave, moved over Florida, moved into the Gulf, and I'll never forget that night, that Friday night, there was a Saints game, and all models and that error, Cohen, the margin of error that we always show, indicated that the storm likely was going to hit somewhere around Apalachicola, Panama City. So we were just kind of feeling pretty good about it. Well, the storm continued westward, and I'll never forget on the air, I said the farther west it goes, the cone has got to shift. And sure enough, it continued that west-northwest movement without the turn. And then later that evening, the new projections came out from Florida to New Orleans, basically dead on with a strengthening storm. And at that point, I'll never forget Ray Nagin. He was making the rounds with all the different TV stations. And that evening, after he got off the air, I was with WGNO at the time. And, he said, what do you think? And I said, well, this thing has been moving farther west. The concern is, the farther west it goes, eventually storms like to bend to the north, and eventually with the rotation of the Earth and the Coriolis effect and the ridge of high pressure, as it bends north, we're going to be pretty close to major impact. So at that point, it continued to get stronger and stronger and stronger, and it's amazing, a storm of that magnitude, how quickly rapid intensification became a word, a phrase, where we never really thought about, the storm is getting stronger. Well, rapid intensification, again, just like we had with Aaron went from basically a tropical storm to a Category 5 in like a day. Yeah. So rapid intensification is a real thing. So my concern is, as a meteorologist, is if you remember for Hurricane Ida, there was no evacuation called. Therefore, a lot of people stayed and there was a lot of issues with it. But if a Category 2 is out there and it's moving and we're in the margin of error, and they said, well, we're not going to evacuate for a 2, But at the last 12 hours, it blows up into a major storm. You don't have time to leave. So that's the issue with rapid intensification.
We used to think that. Oh, if it's a 1 or a 2, I'll just stay here.
We can handle it.
Yeah, well, but they seem to be intensifying really rapidly. I mean, we saw that with the storms that have hit Florida over the past couple of years.
Warmer waters, you know, a lot of people want to get into it with me about global warming. Is it cyclical? Is it a real thing? And, you know, the reality is sea surface temperatures are warmer. Air temperatures are warmer. When I was a kid in New Orleans, I go trick-or-treating with a coat. You couldn't even see my costume. Now, you're lucky to wear shorts, if not, you know, something even less because it's so hot.
Sweaty with the mask on.
Exactly. So, you know, you can check the boxes of getting colder later, warmer than average sea surface temperatures, tornado alley shifting from basically Oklahoma to North Louisiana into Mississippi and Alabama. Global warming or not, could be a cycle. I don't know, but in my career in 30 years, I've seen the changes.
We're experiencing them,
Certainly are.
So, you know, getting back to Katrina, Katrina did get to a 5 level, right?
It did. It did. Then we can do a 3 as it moved inland. But again, the inertia from all the wave action in that northeastern quadrant where you get that big tidal surge at landfall, I mean, the waves are not going to decrease just because the winds decrease. You still have all that inertia pushing. And, you know, Plaquemines Parish got it, but, you know, really the worst of it was in the Mississippi Gulf Coast because they were on that right side. But I'll never forget when Friday night everything changed. On Saturday afternoon, how do we get Bruce out? How do we get the station evacuated? And at that point, it was a mandatory evacuation. So we got the last helicopter out, and I'll never forget, I had to meet the chopper at the Dome. We were in the New Orleans Center at the time, and I had a bag with suits, and the pilot said, we have other passengers. You can only bring this, this, and this. I left expensive suits, everything, right on the tarmac at the Superdome because of weight. And I was like, let this be the worst thing. But I'll never forget flying to Baton Rouge. We actually paralleled I-10. So we're flying over, you know, to Baton Rouge.
Gridlock.
Not only gridlock, but the contraflow.
Yeah.
To see all the cars going in one direction in gridlock, you're right.
The wrong side. Yeah.
It's like, this is why they call it the calm before the storm. It was a gorgeous, sunny day. And to think that people are driving and saying, what are we doing? It's beautiful. And to think in 36 hours what may happen, it was a really weird feeling to wrap your head around. But seeing all the cars going out, seeing everybody trying to get out, you know, trying to get school buses to get people out. You know, what is it, 40% of New Orleanians don't even have cars? So how do you get them out? How do you keep them safe? Do you open the Dome? Do you open the convention center? And we all saw the outcome of all that, which was not a great plan.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, my bigger concern for today is the rapid intensification of storms, just like Aaron did. I mean, when you've got the ingredients there that we haven't really studied or seen in the last 15, 20 years, we're learning quickly, unfortunately, you know, by
That's the new
by
reality.
the event.
You know, there was also construction along I-10 in Baton Rouge.
Exactly.
So suddenly when all those cars were coming, part of I-10 were one lane at Baton Rouge.
It took people 8 to 12 hours to get to Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
I mean, it was in the frustration level and people running out of gas, and it was chaos. I mean, that was bad enough and tragic enough, but the aftermath, you know, everyone thought for a few hours we got through it. You know, I mean, everything looked pretty good.
And we will be talking as we move along here.
So,
Thanks a lot, Bruce.
sure.
I'm going to move on over to Dave right now because, as you said, everybody thought we got through it, that we, quote, dodged that bullet. But then we started hearing about waters rising.
And that was the narrative. We've dodged a bullet. Hurricane Katrina, the worst case scenario came through, and hey, we're all right. Yes, it picked up the casino boats in the Mississippi Gulf Coast and flipped them over across the beach. Yeah, it has wiped out parts of coastal Mississippi and lower Plaquemines. But we thought that the bowl, the New Orleans metro area on the South Shore, had escaped. What we had all heard was the big one. We had seen what they called the slosh models of the water filling the bowl and not stopping till it got the same level in the city that it was in the lake. And everyone really thought at first everything was okay. Now remember, this was before the internet as we know it now, it was before smartphones as we know it now. Cell phones had gone down because all the towers were either knocked down or they ran out of fuel for their generators. So people could not communicate. But we were getting people either on the few landlines that were working calling the radio station, or our crews that were out looking for damage in the immediate aftermath of the storm. We're all puzzled by, why is the water still rising? If we've dodged the bullet. And the initial theory was, well, it's just moving around. That the rainwater that fell and the water that we knew the levees had water splashing over the top of them, particularly along the industrial canal. We had heard those reports during the storm. So the initial theory was, oh, the water's just moving around. It's finding the low ground. And that's why some neighborhoods it's still coming up. But it just kept happening. And New Orleans City Hall was absolutely no help. Everyone had left City Hall, had gone across the street to the hotel. The mayor, the command staff, everybody. There was no communication coming out of New Orleans City Hall. I happened to be at the Emergency Operations Center in Jefferson Parish. And finally, I went into the emergency portion of the EOC, and I got the then Emergency Operations Director, Walter Maestri, and I said, why is the water still rising? He said, we've been trying to figure that out for the last several hours because it was coming up in Old Metairie. And he said, we've figured out it's coming in on Metairie Road and on Veterans Memorial Boulevard. I said, why? He said, we think the levees broke. I said, what levees? And he said, not the lake levees, but the interior canal levees.
The outfall canals.
The outfall canals. And no one had really ever put that scenario together, that the storm, when it passed, would push the water back out of the lake into the canals, and the infamous eye walls that were not constructed properly, and all of the now documented shortcuts that were taken, building the levee walls and everything else, they just disintegrated.
On the 17th Street Canal.
On the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, we know the Industrial Canal. We know that the barge came through the Industrial Canal, landed on houses and school buses, and that took out the Industrial Canal. So we had all three of the outfall canals and the Industrial Canal now were essentially gone, or had gaping holes in them.
Yeah.
And so it was at that moment that I remember vividly, because we were on the air, and all the officials we could get a hold of were going with the we dodged a bullet scenario and telling people a couple of days we'll get back on our feet. And I remember I said to the studio, I said, I know what you guys are talking about. You think it's important, but you need to come to me because the story is changing. And they threw it to me, and I said, we have just confirmed that the levees have failed, that the worst case scenario is coming to fruition. The slosh models are no longer models. It is a reality. And the 18-foot below sea level bowl that we call New Orleans and Metairie is now filling with water, and it will not stop till it's just as deep as the lake. And that it was at that moment we started begging people. We stopped reporting at that point, and we just started begging people, if you're in New Orleans, if you're on the East Bank of Jefferson Parish, do whatever you have to get to elevated roadways and get out. And
which was easier said than done.
That's why there are so many fatalities. The water rose so quickly, especially in the Bucktown area on Robert E. Lee side, or Ellen Toussaint now.
Lakeview,
They had no chance. I mean, I have a friend who lived basically a block from the breach, and he survived it. But he said, Bruce, the house filled up within literally 4 to 5 minutes. I mean, how do you react?
It went from a couple of inches of rainwater to 14 to 15 feet of flood water.
I had friends who lived in the UNO area, and they, had done fine, and then suddenly the water came up to their second floor.
Quickly.
Yeah, very, very quickly. That was, London Avenue.
I've mentioned to Dave many times, I was listening that moment when he made that announcement. We were in central Louisiana, and this was on Monday. We figured, hey, we survived. We'll be back home from Wednesday. That moment, life changed.
Yes,
everything changed.
Everybody's heart dropped. We heard about rescues from Coast Guard helicopters.
Yeah.
At that point, when you go from rescue missions to an emergency flood or flood emergency, that's rescue. and we heard about choppers. And at that point, we said the levees must have broken.
And let's go on over to LeBron right now, because let's talk about these evacuations. When was mandatory evacuation called?
27th, I think. The evening
9
of
a.m.
Yeah, the 27th.
9 a.m. Saturday morning.
But to take effect on the 28th, is that what it was?
Yeah, but everyone just said, "Oh no,"
Right.
and they
And
got
weren't
up
they
and
doing
went.
it by
Started
lower
heading up.
parishes
But-
first, and to get them out, and then
When was contraflow enacted? Was that on Sunday?
Contraflow was enacted
Saturday afternoon.
On that Sunday, the
afternoon,
20th?
yes.
Saturday
And to back up a little bit on the whole
Yeah.
evacuation thing, because just recently, and we've been talking to the LSU folks with, the big 20th coming up, and the folks that put together the whole contraflow plan. And the gentleman says, hey, in the very beginning, there was no plan for any American city to evacuate the city, so to speak, right? The folks in the Nagin administration, those that I talked to this week, said, LeBron, it was a plan to get the elderly out. There was a plan to get a not very well executed plan, mind you, the disabled out. Nothing near the ecosystem that exists today when you talk about the whole NOLA ready system and all of that and the evacueers and everything else. No, that's 20 years has given us that. So when we talk about the evacuation, you also had a culture of New Orleanians, and this is not everyone, but a culture of New Orleanians who had never evacuated. Many low-income folks who didn't have transportation or no way to get out or whatever. And as you're putting your plan together, I'll say, so what are we talking about with these people, right? And I don't think you have enough buses to get that many people out, which of course becomes the late plan, and I think due to what you're talking about, Bruce, of the rapid intensification of this thing flipping that quickly, you hear Mayor Nagin months later admit that, I probably should have called it earlier. I don't know if that would have helped that group of people, quite frankly. But it's the perfect storm for our city, and the end result becomes we need a shelter of last resort for some of these people, and it winds up being, 25, 30,000 in the Superdome?
Another 10,000 that just showed up at the convention center.
That is correct. And
Walk-ups,
so so where do we put these people, right? And, as you mentioned earlier, we know the Superdome turns out to be not a very good idea. What does 20 years give us? 20 years gives us now, there is no shelters here in the city. We don't want to shelter anybody. And for two reasons. One, we don't want to be responsible for having to, take the safety of anyone while a storm is passing. But number two, the end result of 3, 4, 5 days, how do we feed these people? How do we keep them cool? How do we keep them with water? And so that's an impossible task for any government or any entity to let on to. But in terms of the evacuation, contraflow was a big thing, which also now comes 20 years later to where, because of rapid intensification, DOTD says, we're willing to execute it, but in just Ida, Cynthia Lee Sheng and all of the officials are like, this thing intensifies too quickly for us to execute.
Because it takes time.
Because it takes about 72 hours to pull it.
it's more dangerous for people to be on an 8-hour trip to Baton Rouge caught in a hurricane.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very different landscape in which the lens we can look at it now 20 years later versus then. But in terms of what plan there was then, it was not very well executed. We didn't have the coordination between the agencies as well as now is supposedly put together with RTA and the different bus companies and everything else and the military and everything. None of that.
And so that, as a result, there were tens of thousands of people who were left out by the dome, by the convention center, with no help, no water, no food, et cetera. That was very slow to come. And then finally evacuation was, 5 or 6 days after the storm. And then there were the rumors, and then there was facts, but there were a lot of rumors too that impacted people getting help.
Oh, absolutely. The biggest one was that people were shooting at the rescue helicopters. That was CNN reported people were shooting at rescue helicopters. And the White House heard that, and that filtered down to the National Guard and the Coast Guard, and they grounded all of the rescue helicopters because they were not going to risk the rescuers or the people who'd been rescued who were on those choppers getting shot down. We now know that that was an erroneous report, that some people were shooting guns into the air trying to get attention because they wanted to be rescued. They were trapped on top of homes, on top of businesses, Some people were trapped on top of grave sites.
Wow.
I know personally one man and his wife who sat on top of a grave in one of the cemeteries in Lakeview for 12 hours.
Because it's the highest point of where they were?
That was the only way they could get out of the water.
Wow.
So CNN's one erroneous report about people shooting at helicopters was disastrous because it stopped the entire rescue operation. Now, there still were boats going out. That was, in fact, the Cajun Navy's birth when Harry Lee said, if you have a boat, bring it to the traffic circle on Airline Drive. We're launching from there, and we're going to get out and rescue people. And they did. They sent thousands of boats out that way. But there were lots of rumors. We mentioned earlier how bad communications were. NOPD couldn't even talk to each other on their radios, let alone talk to other agencies. And I'll never forget NOPD chief then, Eddie Compass, coming and telling us stories about what was going on when it was, you know the game of operator you played when you were a kid? When one would whisper to the other, to the other, to the other? Well, by the time it got back to the chief, these stories had been changed, exaggerated, and were so wrong. He told us that people were in shootouts in the convention center, that children were being raped in the convention center, that bodies were stacking up in the freezers that weren't working, but in the freezers in the convention center. Because without their radios, without telephones, there was no texting then.
This is how the rumor
there was no
getting
internet.
To the chief, and this is
so the
holy
chief
cow.
was being told these things, and he was reporting them on the radio.
Yeah.
And none of them happened. I'll never forget a couple of days after the storm interviewing the National Guard incident commander at the Superdome. And he said, I don't know why people keep asking me about all the murders. There wasn't a single murder in the Superdome. But those reports all got out. He said there was a suicide. There was a man who got so distraught he jumped from the upper levels. There were 4 medical emergencies or natural deaths. But that was it.
And special needs, lady in the wheelchair, I'll never forget her.
Oh, sitting in
Where
front of the
in front of the convention center.
Yeah, that was-
I mean, just no oxygen,
hard to
no.
see.
It's hard
Yeah,
to see.
Let me tell you what was a key rumor, and I think it was Ray Nagin or somebody told us to Nagin that said that the city would probably be flooded for 6 months. Now, a key thing here is that this was right at the time when school was starting.
Right.
So you got all these parents and kids all over the state, and they're hearing it's going to be flooded for 6 months. And so the question is, where do kids
do we
go to
go?
school?
Yeah.
And they had to make a lot of decisions. Some people went and bought a house somewhere else for that.
Well, that's why New Orleans population, not only with the floods, a lot of people didn't come back.
Yeah.
40,000 stayed in Texas,
But that
20,000
rumor-
stayed in
but
Atlanta.
that rumor was really pivotal, though, in the population accumulation and distribution.
Well, but now
Absolutely.
that was an inaccuracy more than it was a rumor, because
Right.
I remember Chris Miller, one of our reporters, interviewed the Army Corps of Engineers and the National Guard in the hours before landfall. And they actually had a binder that said dewatering plan. And their dewatering plan was a 6-month plan to empty the city of floodwaters based on those slosh models we talked about earlier, that if the worst case scenario ever happened, the up to 18 feet of water that would fill the city, they thought that toxic soup, was what they called it, would take 6 months to empty out. Thank God it only took 6 weeks.
Yeah.
But they really thought it was going to take
And thank
much
God
longer.
it wasn't 6 months. You wanted to touch quickly now on government response, and that's all we have now. We're quickly running out of time.
Well, a couple of people I wanted to mention was Ray Nagin. I remember that that Saturday night when it was obvious it was coming, all the TV stations were doing continuous coverage, especially from the 10 o'clock hour on. I was watching, and during that hour, Nagin made it to every TV station.
He did.
He did. I mean, to his credit, it was the same message: leave town is coming. And I think this is like going to be the worst moment in the career of any mayor, to have to go around and tell you all the people to leave town.
On his watch.
Yeah, on doing that. And so that was the thing. The other thing, I want to mention George Bush, the president, George Bush the younger. I mean, he got a bad reputation from it. But what really aggravated things, and it was with the best of intentions, was that picture that was taken. He was in Texas when it happened, and they flew back to Washington during Air Force One, and somebody thought it'd be a good idea to take a picture of Bush by a window looking down at Louisiana. And I think that was supposed to show compassion and concern. What it did, it looked like the emperor flying over the
flying
president,
over the
and it was
city,
well
right.
circulated, and it really made Bush look bad.
Right.
And then Kathleen Blanco, I mean, I think she tried the best, but she seemed to get caught up in the fire, though, between Karl Rove and the Republican administration in Washington, versus a Democrat. And they were all kind of vicious about using the National Guard, and she had a hard time.
Well, and there was a big legal battle between the White House and the governor's mansion about who could call up the National Guard, who would be in charge of the National Guard. And that's when Nagin called in and used some very strong language, full of explicatives, saying he didn't care who was in charge. They needed to send someone down here and now because people were dying. And that's when they finally both said, all right, just move them in, send the military. And that's when they called up the 82nd Airborne, the active military, along with the National Guard, and started flooding the city with soldiers.
And the retired general, what's his name?
Honorary.
Never forget him, right?
Who Nagin referred to as that John Wayne type character.
That John Wayne
And
dude.
indeed
Tell you what, he did a job, though.
Yeah.
He whipped him into line.
We could talk for the next hour or two or three
Oh,
or
yeah.
four, but we're
Easily.
running out of time. So right now, memories. What are your memories that really stick out? Just about 20, 25 seconds worth. Over to you.
Well, I remember that week seeing Nagin before all this was coming and said, Mayor, how's everything going? I said, hey, man, things are fine here. Things are really good in the city. That day, the Federal City project had been approved, and the Trump organization had been in town to announce they're going to build a new skyscraper. So he says, man, there's really great things happening. I think that was that Wednesday, and he was just so upbeat.
How things did change. Bruce?
I think it was once we got the helicopter video for the first time to see the breaches, to see the water gushing into the city, just areas that were just literally lakes and rooftops of lower 9 homes, to the gutter. It was just, it was surreal. There are a couple of times on air I almost broke down because this is our home.
Right.
I'm a victim too. So seeing the flooding was awful.
And the fires also.
And the fire,
fires, yeah,
natural
that's
gas fires, yes.
LeBron?
You know what? In the aftermath, I think the thing that touched me the most is the help that came from a bunch of different places, right? And from different organizations. We live next door to the Deaf Church on Canal Boulevard. And for a solid 2 years, groups came from elsewhere, and they'd stay in the community center and continue to work on the church. They had no money, and it was just a touching thing to see. And that was sort of replayed across the city, across the region.
Right, internationally too.
Yes,
The city
people
got a
came
lot
here
of
and
aid.
stayed and helped.
Right. Dave, wrap it up with you.
A personal memory, days into the coverage, and my family had been evacuated. I was in the city still working, and I finally was able to get an old bag phone that was able to hit a cell tower on an offshore rig and call my wife. Wow. And my youngest daughter didn't believe I was alive because they had watched the coverage on television and saw 80% of the city underwater, and she just didn't believe it. So they were in central Louisiana, probably not far from where you were, and I said, all right, drive to Baton Rouge. I drove to Baton Rouge. My wife and my kids and I met up in Baton Rouge. They all got to see I was still alive.
Dave,
and
that's
that was-
really quite
Yeah,
touching,
that's
really
awesome.
touching. What a story. All right, guys.
And you still are.
Great. Yeah, great discussion. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for watching. And we're going to have a second part of Informed Sources Katrina special coming up next week. So we'll see you then. Have a good evening.
Support for this program comes from the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation, committed to funding educational causes.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.